I actually made a mistake. Actually, my grand would have been 113, not 100. Sorry. So that was, but it was her birthday yesterday. Anyway, so for all this, in the schut of all the cholim of Klal Yisrael and the protection of Hashem's protection of all the armed forces of the Holy Land. Okay. Now, continuing the theme of dealing with non-Jews on Shabbat, there's another interesting question that's brought here. Buying shares in a company that operates on Shabbat. Okay, the question is it permitted to buy stock in a public company managed by non-Jews who operate their company on Shabbos and Yom Tov? The answer is yes, it is permitted. The poskim explain that buying shares in a company is not the same as becoming a partner in that company. Buying shares is merely a method of investing. The buyer hopes that the value of the shares will rise and enable him to turn a profit when he sells them. He has no intent or interest in becoming an owner or a manager of the company. Although all publicly traded companies must have an annual meeting where officers are elected by the shareholders, it is known that this is merely a formality. And after all is said and done, the power to run the company remain in the hands of the board. The individual minority shareholders have no say or power to speak of. Thus, buying minority shares in a non-Jewish company which operates on Shabbos and Yom Tov is not considered as if one is becoming a partner with a non-Jew or employing the non-Jewish employees, and is therefore permitted. And then the last question, what about buying stock in a public company whose board members are non-observant Jews who operate the company on Shabbos and Yom Tov? Is that considered as if the investor is contributing to the company's finances and thereby aiding and abetting Shabbos desecrators? That's a question. Most contemporary poskim rule that buying stock is not considered to be aiding and abetting Shabbos desecrators, as there is no shortage of investors who are already able to buy shares. Anyone who buys shares does so for his own investment purposes, not for the purpose of financing the company.
Good. Interesting. All right.
I'm glad to have shared that with you, Damon.
Me too. So we are dealing with the 67th daf, and we're dealing with Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 5, verse 23 and 24. If you remember, it said, and he shall return the stolen item that he stole. And we learned that the word that he stole was superfluous. It apparently seems, but obviously it's coming to teach us something. And the verse continues and says, and he shall pay it in its principal amount, and its fifth he shall add to it. Now you remember when it's what the fifth amount was for, was when he was caught lying about it. Okay? The Gemara now cites an Amoraic statement regarding physical change. Rav Chisda said in the name of Rav Yonasan, from where do we derive with respect to a physical change that it affects acquisition? For it is already stated, and he shall return the stolen article. So what then does the Torah mean to teach when it states that apparently superfluous words that he stole? It teaches that if the stolen article is still as is, when he stole it, he shall return it intact. But if not, in other words, the thief either transformed it physically or sold it or slaughtered it, it is only money that is required to pay. He's not required to return the stolen article itself if it's no longer in existence or it's changed, but rather its value at the time of the theft. Okay, so this obviously includes physical changes. So the Gemara asks, but you know, this expression that he stole isn't superfluous for this exposition. In other words, it's not, you don't only need it for this exposition, it's needed to exclude what one's father stole, to teach that one does not add a fit when paying for what his father stole. So let me just give you a scenario here. So there was Shimon, and his father Levi was a thief. And what happened is he stole money, and then he made a false oath, and he denied that he'd ever stolen the money. And if he was caught in his lifetime, he would have been liable to the 1/5 surcharge had he confessed or come clean at least before he died. But anyway, his heirs, if it ever comes to trial, are only liable to pay the principal, but not the additional fifth. Why? Because the word, and its fifth, he shall add to it. So accordingly, the word he is saying that the succeeding obligation to add a fifth is only to the one who is making restitution for his own theft, but not to one who is making restitution for someone else. In other words, maybe one of his parents stole the money. So it's saying that you don't necessarily need this to prove that physical change is considered to where the owner doesn't have to return the original article and he can pay the cash equivalent. It's coming to teach you about this fifth principle. So it's asking the Gemara, so where do we learn about physical changes? So the Gemara answers, well, if so that the Torah meant only to exclude paying a fifth for one's father's theft, let the merciful one write in his Torah simply, and he shall return what he's stolen. Why? Because if instead of the stolen article that he stole, that would have sufficed to imply that the exclusion of what his father stole. Because if it said, if he has to return what he's stolen, it's obviously the person has stolen. You still got that superfluous statement, and he stole. Okay, it's a bit noisy from your side. Can you see me? Can you hear me? I've lost you.
Yeah, sorry. No, it's fine. I'm back on track.
Okay. So what we're saying here is that you can, in fact, you don't have to only learn one principle. You can learn two things from this statement. Number one, it teaches that you don't pay a fifth for what somebody else has stolen and you're making restitution on their behalf, and that you return the stolen article itself when it is in the same form as when he stole it. So if the thief physically changed the item and he changed wool into a jersey and he made a jersey out of it, or he pressed olives into olive oil, in that particular case, it gives the financial equivalent. It's coming to teach you both principles, okay? So we want to know, is there any case, so that was brought, as you know, from Rav Chisda, who said in the name of Rav Yonasan. But there are those who say that Rav Chisda said as follows, and actually an opposite view. In other words, where do we derive with respect to a physical change that it does not affect acquisition? Because the first one is a proof that it does affect acquisition. And there are those that said Rav Chisda stated it the other way around, it does not affect acquisition, because it stated, and he shall return the stolen article, which implies that he must return the stolen article himself in all cases. So then the Gemara asks, well, that's regardless whether it's in the same physical form or not. So that's what the Gemara is saying, is maybe whether it's changed form or not, you have to return it as is. So the Gemara says, but it is written that he stole, which seems to imply that he must return the stolen item itself, only when it's still in the same form when he stole it. Okay? So the Gemara says that that clause is needed to teach that one adds a fifth for what he himself has stolen, but he does not add a fifth for what his father has stolen. So in other words, Rav Chisda said in the name of Rav Yochanan, the first opinion teaches that physical change does affect acquisition. It's also coming to teach you that what you pay in terms of theft on somebody's behalf, you don't have to pay the 1/5 surcharge, because that's for lying and you were not the one that lied. And there's those that say that he has to return what he stole, whatever state it was in, because it uses the verse, and he returned the stolen articles, which says in all cases it must be like that, which means a physical change doesn't necessarily imply that you pay the financial equivalent. But what it is coming to teach you, according to both opinions, is that there is no 1/5 surcharge if you haven't lied about what is stolen and paying off somebody's debt on their behalf. Okay, so now we're learning a different principle. So we're on 67a3, and the Gemara cites an Amoraic statement regarding Yeush, despair. Ulla said, from where do we derive with regard to despair that it does not affect acquisition? Okay. So it says, for it stated, and you bring what is stolen, the lame and the sick shall I accept it from your hand. So what it's talking about here is it's a verse in Malachi chapter 1 verse 13 that it rebukes the Jewish people for sacrificing animals that are disqualified for offerings. So there's different animals that are disqualified. The one is animals that are stolen, animals that are lame, or animals that are sickly. Now, if you take a look at a lame animal or an animal that's got a blemish, a mum, it's already mentioning it in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 22, verse 17 to 25. And the problem with an animal that can't walk or has a blemish is it's a permanent condition. So therefore, the animal remains permanently disqualified, according to Rashi. So it's saying it's the same as far as listing the stolen animal, because when you list them together, the verse implies that the stolen animal is analogous to the lame one. And it teaches, therefore, that just as the lame one is one that has no remedy whatsoever because it's in a permanent state of disrepair, it can't be offered as a korban, so too it's permanent that it disqualifies it for an offering if somebody's stolen an item. It's got no remedy. So that makes no difference whether it was before the original owner despaired, and it makes no difference after the original owner's despair. Because what is this coming to prove is that when you're trying to do a mitzvah by doing an aveira, it has nothing to do with whether the original owner despaired or not. You cannot, through a sin, elevate yourself if the way you made the mitzvah was through a sin itself. Does that make sense? So in all these cases, it's disqualified for use as an offering. So this proves, according to Ulla, that despair alone does not affect acquisition. Makes sense? So, if despair did affect acquisition, then one who consecrated a stolen animal after the original owner had despaired of recovering it would be permitted to bring it as a sacrifice, guys. So even though Yush alone does not affect acquisition, everybody agrees that when a thief consecrates a stolen item after the original owner despairs of recovering it, it's the consecration that takes effect, and although the animal is acquired through despair and a change of name, we can still say it's invalid as an offering, because the principle is that you cannot have a mitzvah that comes about through transgression. Now, in a case where this is not necessarily a proof, in a different case, according to some opinions, that Rav Ila is saying that despair doesn't affect acquisition, because it's only in the case where you're trying to do a mitzvah through the sin that despair doesn't affect acquisition. But as far as the thief making a physical change, or the original owner despairing, the thief can use it for his personal use after the owner despairs, and if he's caught, he has to pay the financial equivalent of what that animal was worth at the time of theft, plus penalties of whatever is appropriate. But you cannot still consecrate it. It's invalid as an offering. Because let's just see what the process exactly was. The process was that the owner despaired at the same process where you try to do a mitzvah. So the mitzvah is as follows, is you're taking it from the mundane to a place of hekdesh for consecration, and therefore that act of transportation itself is the mitzvah, as well as the sacrificing of that animal. In other words, that thought allocation to do a mitzvah with it, to take it from a mundane activity to a holy place, and then to sacrifice it. So if you stole it when involved with the mitzvah, it's already considered null and void. Okay? So Rabbeinu Tam has a different approach to the sugya. He said that it's evident from other Talmudic sources that Ulla in fact holds that Yush alone does affect acquisition. That was the source. But that despair cannot affect acquisitions with respect to offerings, because of that invalidation that you cannot do a mitzvah through an aveira. All right, that's fairly straightforward. Now, there's an alternative source that despair does not affect acquisition. Rava said it's derived from here, as a brass expounds the verse states, if an olah is his offering. We've gone through this already. It's just giving, obviously, a summary. So when it uses the term his offering, if you say that he consecrated it prior to the owner's despair, then it's obvious that the animal cannot be brought as an olah, because the thief's consecration doesn't take effect and the animal remains unconsecrated. So in other words, you can't steal what the original owner has not given up, because that animal is not yours. So why would it teach you the obvious? Remember, we did this. It says, I don't need a verse to teach the obvious. Rather, is it not referring to when the thief consecrated the stolen animal after the owner's despair? And thus you learn from that despair that it does not affect acquisition. Indeed, learn from this. So we learned, if you remember, that Rava was the one who said that the brisa refers to where he stole his fellow's consecrated offering. And it doesn't demonstrate that despair does not affect acquisition at all. All it demonstrates is that it's only considered despair if you take it from the owner's location, but not if it's already consecrated within temple grounds. And all that's happening there is the guy thinks he's made the consecration. He's relaxed at home. He doesn't despair because he's not worried about it. He's done his part. And the thief stole it from the temple and given it to another Kohen to sacrifice. That's the case we're talking about. So the Gemara says, yes, you can say that because we've gone through this issue with Rava. But if you prefer to say that either maybe Rava retracted his statement, or if you prefer to say that one of those statements was stated by Rav Papa. So what does Rav Papa have to do with it? The reason being is Rav Papa was a disciple of Rava, and he would generally relate his master's teachings to his students. So even when Rav Papa would relate his own teachings, which might have differed from Rav Papa, his students would sometimes think that those were actually Rava's teachings, and they would subsequently attach them or attribute them to Rava when relating them to others. So in other words, Rav Papa and Rava could have had a different opinion as far as that's concerned. Okay? So the Gemara now cites the Mishnah that reads, whereas the rule of fourfold and fivefold payments, etc. Now, obviously, you know it applies where only an ox or a sheep alone is stolen. Because you remember there was a penalty of the thief pays double when it was any other animal or when it was any other inanimate object or utensil that was stolen. It was a double payment, the first for the principal amount and the same percentage for the penalty amount. Because what did the verse say? If a man shall steal an ox or a sheep and he slaughters it or he sells it, he shall pay 5 cattle in the place of an ox and 4 sheep in the place of a sheep. Okay, so where was that? If you remember, that was in Deuteronomy chapter it was in Deuteronomy, but the Gemara is coming to ask a question on that. It says that before, if you remember that we did learn certain Gezerah Shabbos. With regards to Shabbat, we learned through a Gezerah Shabbos based on the word ox from the laws of Shabbat as follows, and that was in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 14. Guys, you'll remember this. I think it was in the 37th daf. I think so. I'm not 100% sure. But what happened was when it taught us the laws of ox from the laws of Shabbat, it said just as there in regard to the Sabbath, the law with respect to wild animals and birds is the same as with respect to them. The ox and donkey specified in the passage. So to here in regard to the fourfold and fivefold payments, the law with respect to wild animals and birds is the same as the law with respect to them, the ox and sheep specified in the passage. So what it's saying is, I don't know if you remember what we did, is we basically stated before, is that we learned that you can't work your ox on the Sabbath. And we said, so too, if you've got other animals, you can't make them work on the Sabbath. So we did a Gezerah Shabbat for ox to include any other animals that you might have in your care, that you couldn't work them on the Sabbath, neither your slaves nor your maidservants, etc., etc. But the Gezerah Shabbat was specifically with ox and related to other animals. Do you remember that? So it's saying, why don't we have the term ox and sheep here, stating that it's a fourfold and fivefold payment, and use the same Gezerah Shabbat, the principle that we used to expound in the passage of Shabbat, that those laws apply to all animals, even to wild beasts and birds, for example. Why can't you expound this Gezerah Shabbat with respect to the fourfold and fivefold penalties as well, and apply them to all animals, even to wild beasts and birds? Okay. So what it's saying is that you should differentiate between two things. Is that if you steal an animal but can carry it on your shoulder, you pay, Kevin, you're falling asleep a little bit.
Double.
No. It's saying if you use that Gezerah Shabbat with the sheep, you pay fivefold for you pay fourfold for a sheep. Why? Because to put an animal on your shoulder and schlep it is humiliating. And therefore you only pay 4 times the penalty, because that humiliation removes a extra penalty. With an ox that you lead out, Gavin, with dignity, there's no humiliation, because nobody's going to question you. Therefore, that because you haven't suffered humiliation, the person pays for the principal plus 4 times, which equals 5 times in total. Whereas with a sheep, you pay the principal plus 3 times, which is 4 times in total. So it's saying anytime you carry an animal over your shoulder and humiliate yourself, you only have to pay a penalty of 3 times plus the principal amount. But if you don't embarrass yourself, you don't get any leniency for the humiliation because you suffered none. And therefore you pay a penalty of 4 plus the principal amount. So let's take the method of stealing and apply it to other animals as well, using the same principle of Gezerah Shabbat we learned in Shabbat with regards to learning that other animals we couldn't use to work them. You see what we're saying? Okay. Guys, everybody's falling asleep at one person's A-ward. Okay. So the Gemara answers that Rava said in the passage about theft, the verse states ox and sheep and ox and sheep 2 times. How come it does that? Because the verse says, if you remember, it was in Shmot in Exodus.
Damon, go back 30 seconds, please. You froze, and the audio also did.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? Guys, oh dear. Guys, can you hear me now? Guys?
Yeah, but you froze and it was, I think, go back 30 seconds.
No problem. Okay. So I'm going to repeat what I said. So Rava comments and says in the passage about theft, the verse states ox and sheep twice. Okay, I'm just going to read the verse. It's in Shmot, Exodus chapter 21, verse 37. And it says, if a man shall steal an ox or a sheep, and he slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 cattle in the place of an ox and 4 sheep in the place of a sheep. So it mentions ox and sheep twice, each one of them twice. So Rava's commenting on that and saying that basically this teaches that an ox and a sheep, yes, they are subject to the 4-fold and 5-fold payment, but anything else is not subject to those penalties. Meaning that the Torah's extra specification of an ox and a sheep is superfluous, it's unnecessary. And therefore that wording is coming to teach you something special, that the law is limited to an ox and a sheep, but it's not to be derived through a Gezerah Shabbat to include other animals. Okay. Guys, have I lost you? How's the reception?
No, it's okay.
Okay. So
I think we all just,
you all just tired, I get it. So the Gemara analyzes Rava's exposition, and they say, look, now which mention of ox and sheep is superfluous? In other words, it's saying, if you're saying one of those words are superfluous, we're going to prove in the Gemara it's not, because each of those words is coming to teach you something. And you can only say that it's only available to teach you that it's subject to an ox and a sheep exclusively if it's superfluous. In other words, you've got that extra wording. But if it's not, you can't come to the conclusion that you can't make the Gezerah Shavah with an ox and sheep. The reason being is that if you study this, it says, for the merciful one should have written in his Torah, very simply, if a man shall steal an ox or a sheep and he slaughters or sells it, he shall pay 5 cattle in the place of it and 4 sheep in the place of it. In other words, use the pronoun it. Okay? And why? Because we would say on our own that 5 cattle are in the place of an ox and 4 sheep in the place of a sheep. Tosfot said. So you could use a pronoun. But the merciful one took the trouble to make sure it was written that there wasn't a pronoun, because you could have mistakenly said that he must pay 9, 5 oxen and 4 sheep for each one. And how do you come to that conclusion? Because unless you have the second specification of an ox and a sheep, it's not superfluous. And if you replace it or substitute it with the pronoun it, in the last verse, you could have come to the conclusion that the 2 pronouns are interchangeable, and therefore you add them. The payment of the 5 cattle, okay, and the payment of the 4 sheep. They're not 2 individual payments. In other words, the former one for a stolen ox and the latter one for a sheep, but one large payment that you make either for an ox or a sheep that one slaughters or sold it after stealing it. So the problem with the pronoun it means it would be referring to either the ox or the sheep mentioned in the beginning of the verse. It could be interchangeable. And you would think that the 2 payments of 4 and 5 are added together to mean that you actually pay a 9-fold payment. Do you get what I'm saying, guys? If you don't get it, ask me.
I think you must
Rephrase.
So you're saying, you're going back to the Gezerah Shavah?
No, we've passed.
Because it sounds like 9. So regardless of what animals, it has to be specified.
No.
Otherwise, you pay 4 sheep and 5 ox.
Let's separate the issue. Rava already covered that the fact that it mentions ox and sheep twice, he's saying it's superfluous, and that's coming to teach you you cannot make a Gezerah Shavah and extrapolate other animals where ox and sheep are in terms of their provisional payments. In other words, you can't take the method of moving the animal and apply it to the other animals like you can when you're taking an ox and applying it to other animals you can't work on the Shabbos. You can't say, just like you lift up a sheep, you pay times 4, which is the principle, times 3 penalties, or the ox, which you dignified lead it, and then you pay it times 5, which is 4 penalties and 1 principle, but there's no embarrassment. You can't apply that to other animals because it mentions ox and sheep twice, and that's not superfluous. It's coming to teach you that you cannot apply the Gezerah Shavah in this case. Then the Gemara is saying, no, it's not superfluous, because which ox and sheep do you have the pasuk removed? Because if you use the second one and you replace it with a pronoun, an interchangeable it. So it says when you've stolen it, you replace it. The problem then, if you're not specific, you could think that if you stole either an ox or a sheep, that you would have to pay the 9-fold payment, meaning you take the 4-fold payment and 5-fold payment together and pay a 9-fold payment for either an ox or a sheep. Or even if you don't come to that conclusion that you add the 2 together, you wouldn't know which animal would you pay a 4-fold or a 5-fold exactly. So the Torah had to specify ox and sheep in the last part of this to teach that 2 individual payments are meant. A 5-fold payment for a stolen ox and a 4-fold payment for stolen sheep specifically. Okay, so it's saying you can't use a pronoun, so it's not superfluous. And if you're saying it was superfluous, only then can it tell you not to apply the Gezerah Shabbat. But since it's not superfluous, we don't know that you can't apply the Gezerah Shabbat. We still have to learn about it. So it's not so, because in the place of it, you need another exposition, because you were taught in a brisa. In other words, it might be the fact that we might have thought that the Torah meant to prescribe a single payment consisting of 9 animals. And the reason the Torah stated in the word, in place of it, or a general pronoun, the second time that the superfluous in the place of it can be expounded for the exposition taught in the following brisa. So we're going to learn that now. The Torah therefore states that if one stole an ox worth of manna, he must pay in its place 5 moribund ones. Now, I didn't know what the heck moribund ones was. In other words, moribund is stating that you have to pay a replacement. In other words, if you say you shall pay 5 cattle and 4 sheep, you could have thought that you may pay this penalty with any cattle or sheep, regardless of the condition. So this term moribund ones, which is like a German word, basically means that you have to replace the animal in place of it, like the pasuk says, in place of the sheep that he stole. And that indicates that the condition of the animal must be a similar size and condition to what you stole. In other words, what you replace it with must be the same value, pretty much as what you stole. So it's been demonstrated that ox and sheep, stated explicitly in the latter part of the pasuk, aren't superfluous, guys, at all. Because if the Torah stated merely in the place of it twice, you could have thought that the Torah maybe is prescribing a single payment consisting of 9 animals, and you could have thought it was either for an ox or a sheep, and you could have thought that maybe you can pay inferior animals and just replace a sheep with a sheep. Whereas here it's saying, look, you've got to take into account the value. Is it the same species of sheep? Is it the same? You know, you get thoroughbreds and you get mixed breeds and you get different weights of animals, different conditions. You have to replace it with the same value animal, both in terms of the penalties as well as the principal amount. And that's what we're coming to learn. Okay? So the Gemara therefore proposes that maybe Rava, well, not maybe, Rava definitely meant to say that the ox and the sheep mentioned in the first part of the verse are superfluous. We've learned the second part for sure not. Because the merciful one should have written in his Torah. Very simply, if a man shall steal and he slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 cattle in place of an ox and 4 sheep in the place of a sheep. Does that make sense? So we've got 2 minutes left. So the Gemara asks, well, okay, so if the merciful one had written it so, I would have mistakenly said that he's not liable to the 4-fold and 5-fold payments until he steals the 2 animals, an ox and a sheep, and slaughters them. Meaning that you could have, that even the first part is not superfluous, because if you state the word, if a man shall steal an ox or sheep, the Torah makes it clear that the prescribed penalty actually pertains to one who stole either the ox or the sheep. And if the Torah had merely written the word steals and he slaughters it as a generic pronoun or sells it, you might have thought it pertains only to one who stole both an ox and a sheep and subsequently slaughtered them. So this teaches if he stole the one, he's liable for it. Okay? So the Gemara persists and asks, granted that we would know that the penalty applies even when he slaughters only one, but I might still have said that he's not liable to the 4-fold or 5-fold payment for selling a stolen animal until he steals both of them, and maybe we were just talking about slaughtering, and sells both of them. So the Gemara says no. We couldn't have made such a mistake because it uses the term or sells it. So it indicates that whether he stole it, sold it, or slaughtered it, you're liable for stealing any one of those animals. It doesn't have to be both. Does that make sense? All right.